Hey, my name is Okente. This is my first speaking video, and I'm recording this audio on my phone, so let's just see how this goes. I had this idea a while ago to draw Medusa in sort of her true representations over time. I know that there's probably a lot more and historical nuances and the shifts in character and all that, but this is what I'm going with right now. Just sort of a broad, two-phase look at her. I apologize to any art historians. So, I'm sure everyone watching this knows Medusa in some sort of way. Whether you're a video game nerd, an actual historian of some kind, or just a fan in general, the most bare-bones understanding of Medusa is that she is a creature from Greek mythology with snakes for hair and the ability to turn anyone who looks into her eyes into stone. Other than serpents for hair and a literally petrifying gaze, though, things get a little bit more complicated because stories drift and this character is over thousands of years old. But the general knowledge is that in Medusa's earliest known appearance, she was actually one of 3 Gorgon sisters and 112% a monster. This is not even in a judgmental way. She was just legitimately a classic Greek myth monster. However, the one thing that did set her apart from her sisters, who I don't know the names of, was that Medusa was mortal, so she could die, but her sisters were not. That's why she's the one to get her head chopped off by Perseus later on. So, getting into the design of Gorgon Medusa, I knew right away that I primarily wanted to reference the stone reliefs we have of her, especially this one that I actually got to see myself and took this picture. For starters, some of the main things that stuck out to me where that Gorgon Medusa actually seems to have a very strong build, with sort of tusk-like fangs on both her upper and lower teeth as well as braids. Yeah, in several depictions of Gorgon Medusa, she actually seems to have dark curly hair as well as her iconic serpents. Also, she's typically seen with her tongue sticking out in this really squared up pose. I'm not entirely sure why, but it definitely does give her a lot of character, sort of like cockiness about her, so I decided to keep it in. Kind of like the gremlin stance that a lot of people do nowadays. Another thing that surprised me was that in several depictions, Gorgon Medusa had wings. I knew I needed to include those, as the idea of her being able to swoop around and scream with their snakes and turn things to stone was too cool an image in my head not to add. I also thought that it sort of tied in with the fact that in the myth, when Perseus cuts off our buff lady's head, she actually gives birth to Pegasus. And by that, I mean that Perseus cuts off her head, and then Pegasus springs from her neck stump, fully formed, before the guy who killed his mother proceeds to hop aboard and ride him off with her head as a trophy. Anyway, so I decided to add Pegasus to Gorgon Medusa's little skirt here, especially as several stone reliefs I found depicted her even holding a miniature Pegasus under her arm to symbolize the relationship. Her clothes were mostly pulled from what I can only assume is a sort of armor she was wearing, which in my mind made sense as she is the only mortal Gorgon sister, so it would make sense for her to take some extra steps to kind of protect herself. I also decided to add 2 snakes curled on her skirt as well, to represent her 2 sisters. Overall, I wanted her whole color palette to be pretty natural and warm, even with these reds and blues I often saw added to her. The idea behind this being that in this version, Medusa was born. She was a naturally occurring creature, and she was a Gorgon from birth, as opposed to the Maiden Medusa coming up. The final thing about Gorgon Medusa, of course, her eyes. They were actually pretty easy, as the stone reliefs already had these sort of startling, wild eyes that I thought were very striking, and so I practically redrew them exactly the same way. But while I'm quite content with how my Gorgon Medusa came out, I'm sure that's not the version that most of you casual Greek myth enjoyers are familiar with. The most popular attestation of the Medusa myth today is that actually, Medusa was once a beautiful mortal woman, completely human, who caught herself in the unfortunate crosshairs of Poseidon, the god king of the seas. Most versions of this story paint her as a priestess of Athena, but regardless, one day Poseidon swoops down to have his way with her, and Medusa rushes into Athena's temple, seeking help from her attacker through the goddess of women and war. However, it's too late, and Medusa is assaulted by Poseidon within the temple by the time Athena makes it down. Now, this next part is still heavily debated to this day. Some interpret Athena as being compassionate to Medusa, and so she magically transforms her to have snakes for hair and a petrifying gaze as a means of protecting herself from any other attacks in the future, as well as a way to get revenge on men and protect the innocent. But others perceive Athena's actions as actually malicious, instead getting offended by Medusa's assault and cursing her with all the powers that victim blaming possesses. But why is this version so different? Again, I'm not exactly an art historian, but basically it's Ovid's fault. You may have heard of him before. He's a well-known figure in Greek history who had a bone to pick with all authorities on account of being exiled from Rome. As a result, his versions of many well-known stories took a slightly different tone than what was commonly told, taking greater pains to paint the gods in a negative light on account of their constant abuse and toying with the helpless mortals. That's why in this story, girl boss Athena is made noticeably more vindictive, and the eventual decapitation of Medusa by Perseus is reframed as the final tragedy in a hapless woman's life, orchestrated cruelly by those with power. There was sort of a good to come out of this, however. As a result of this version of the story gaining in popularity, Maiden Medusa was born. She got a sympathetic backstory other than just being a monster, and nowadays, many people see her as a symbol of surviving assault, with her image commonly being used to represent protecting the innocents with her powers, like she needed to be protected so long ago. So, as you can imagine, Maiden Medusa was a bit more difficult for me to design. Unlike Gorgon Medusa, who had a pretty clear set of characteristics, Maiden Medusa has persisted to the modern day, which means that she's been depicted in every which way, from having a complete serpentine appearance to being just a pretty lady with snake hair. I wrote some notes to try and give myself a clearer idea of what I wanted, especially to contrast her with Gorgon Medusa. I looked up Greek priestesses and decided to give her a headband to tuck back her serpents and sort of a general priestess dress, though I tore up the bottom a bit as I assume she isn't caring too much anymore about keeping it all neat and clean. The eyes were a big issue, because in some versions it's just Medusa's gaze that turns people to stone, but in others it's phrased more as being that in combination with the sort of horror of her appearance. So, I decided to really lean into the fact that this is not natural like with Gorgon Medusa. Maiden Medusa, she was physically changed into what she is, so I decided to actually have the area around her eyes look like scales have torn through her skin and scarred her face, but leave the rest of her still very beautiful to show that this truly was a transfiguration. I tried to give her prominent Greek features as well, like her nose, but with the scales around her eyes, I'm not sure how well it came across. I also considered adding a sword somewhere, but eventually decided against it and gave Maiden Medusa the torch that I commonly saw priestesses holding, as well as a shield to more allude to her role as a protector. In the full body drawing, I drew her mouth sort of splitting open, like I'd seen in Clash of the Titans while I was looking for inspiration. And I sort of imagined that when she's in a more aggressive state, facing off against someone maybe, her mouth does split open and reveal her fangs and forked tongue. But otherwise, it appears human so that she can still be as much of a comforting face as possible. I eventually settled on these sort of blank, pupilless eyes. No matter what kind of pupil I tried to add, none of them felt right, and in the end, I think it gives our Maiden Medusa a sort of regal, mysterious look about her. And especially since in this version, her eyes are more of a focused change, I thought it'd be best to emphasize them the most. So, these are my own designs of the two versions of Medusa, the Gorgon and the Maiden. I'm pretty pleased with how they came out, and I'm curious to hear what others think. I haven't really seen anyone do this, but I have seen people sort of pop others' bubbles when it comes to using Maiden Medusa as a sort of comfort or strength, because she originates from Gorgon Medusa. But in reality, these stories changed all the time, and I think the fact that they're still changing today is really cool. Besides, it's the 21st century and we're beyond pitting women against each other like that. I love both versions of Medusa, but then again, these are just my interpretations. I hope you all enjoyed this huge undertaking of a video, and honestly, if you have any other suggestions for old figures I could do this to again, leave a comment. Thanks for watching. You can subscribe if you want. Bye!